Well, thanks to Jose Antonio de Ori, the Spanish ambassador. He's the one who asked me to come all the way over here, which is really thrilling. I hope to awaken your curiosity a little bit, just a little percentage of what mine is awakened by being here. Thank you also to the Lahore Literary Festival and to all the generosity I've felt and all the organizers and everything else. It's an example of what to do and how things should be done. I'm going to be quite simple, calling attention to the Museo del Prado and to the reasons why we have been seen as a special museum within the context of Western European culture, where great art museums are prevalent in a lot of cities throughout the continent. Even within that context, there has been a long tradition, about 200 years by now, that has considered the Prado a special place, and I'll slowly get into the reason for that. This is a photo of the main building of the Prado. The Prado means field, and the Museo del Prado is the museum that was in the field or in the country outside of the city when the building was made in the late 18th century, in the 1770s or so. Now it's right in the middle of the city. The city extends well towards the east, but it ended there and came towards our direction originally. The museum also incorporates, I think I'm doing this the wrong way. The museum also incorporates, here's an office building. This is part of the main museum. If you walk into the main building, this is connected underground, so you'll be using all this space around here underground. These are the library curator's offices, and this here is what remains of a 17th century palace, which is now under renovation. It will be incorporated into the museum, we hope, by early 2026, and by then we will have what's now being called the Prado campus. We're a mid-sized museum, not a huge museum in terms of the number of objects that we have. Spain divides its collections among public library, archaeological museum, all different kinds of museums, as opposed to what you find in France, for example, where all museums are incorporated into one giant Louvre. So this is a little bit different. Historically, it is, for the most part, very highly regarded as a museum of paintings, even though we have other objects as well. We have about 8,700 paintings, out of which we show about 1,200. And we have a total of 27,000 objects. That includes works on paper, sculptures, decorative arts, many of which are not always on show because they can't be for conservation reasons. But what has given the Prado a special reputation, fame, within the history of European culture in general and artistic culture in particular is its collection of paintings. This is one of these typical grand galleries of late 18th and 19th century European museums that you can find in other cities as well. But just so you have an idea of what the museum looks like. And now I'm doing something wrong. Okay. The idea of collecting art has not always existed. Sorry, let me backtrack on that. The idea of collecting paintings has not always existed. People, of course, have always collected, mainly because by collecting one looked powerful and wealthy. And with that came a genuine appreciation of beauty, artistic quality, artistic expression, and other things, a connection with another part of ourselves. The idea that what one collected was paintings is something that starts in Europe in the early mid-15th century and reaches a grand scale only in the 16th century. And it has a lot to do with the power and money amassed by the Spanish royal family with the conquest of America and the governing by the Habsburgs of a lot of regions of Europe, which include Germany, what we now call Belgium and Holland, and large parts of Italy as well. Some of those regions are the regions where the best art in Europe was being produced at the time. Imitating people that governed what we now call Belgium and regions of what we now called Italy, but at a small scale, extremely high level of artistic craft, but at a small level in terms of numbers, imitating those precedents. This man here on the right, King Philip II of Spain, amassed the largest collection that existed in Europe by the second half of the 16th century in terms of numbers. with all the great names that one would expect at the time. He is what art historians in Europe call the first mega collector. So this is an important idea for me, that at least in Spain we take for granted the fact that what people do, what one is proud of is collections of art. Well, this has not always been the case. In a way, we're seeing now the end of painting, and our appreciation and the value that we put in collections such as the Prado may not be infinite. We may run out of appreciation for these things in the past, just like we have not had it all the way into the past. We may run out of appreciation in the future, I mean. So Philip II is the first collector that buys art understood as a luxury object, which means art made in Flanders, which is a term used back then to refer to what we now call Belgium, and in some artistic centers in Italy, mainly Florence, Venice, and Rome, in the 16th century. He is buying from there mainly, and buying as much as he can. And he has become, by the time he dies in 1598, really a genuine, passionate lover of art. He wants to do what all of us art lovers want to do, which is buy the most and the best that he can get his hands on. His father, the Emperor Charles V, had a large collection of art, not nearly as large as his, but his interest in art had to do with his image as a powerful ruler. It was not as much a passion, a poetic passion for art, as much as his son's is. Another important king for the history of collecting at the Prado in Spain and in Europe is Philip IV, his grandson. Here we see Philip II portrayed by Titian around 1550. The other picture is about 75 years later, 1624, by Velázquez. Two different images of rulers. Philip II is still portraying himself as a military ruler. In fact, he didn't go to war hardly ever. And he is referred to as the first bureaucrat king, or the first king who is at the head of a large state bureaucracy that manages to govern an empire that goes from Latin America to the Philippines, which are named after him. Philip IV is posing as the bureaucrat king. He's not a warrior. He has a piece of paper. It's these papers that manage the business of empire. But notice that they're both posed according to the same formula, the three-quarter view, a table nearby, the hand posing on that table, a helmet on one case, a hat on the other case. Art is very much a formula, a language that is very aware of itself, of its own past, of its own genealogy. Genealogy matters a lot for kings, of course. They are what they are because of where they come from. And they like to make a point in the art that they promote of underscoring the idea of a genealogy as well. I am portrayed and I pose in a way that is similar to that, the way in which the man who justifies my rule posed many years ago. Philip II and Philip IV, second half of the 16th century, third of the 17th century, are probably the two greatest collectors in the history of the Spanish royal family, and the ones that are most important for putting together what we now see at the Prado, even though there are other kings that are important in this regard as well. So far, we're talking about a kind of collecting that is taking place in a royal palace, okay? Not in the Museo del Prado, but in a royal palace. Why am I talking so much about the royal collection? The Museo del Prado is a royal foundation, and it is the heir of the royal collection. In 1819, the museum opens, and paintings are continuously shipped from the royal palace in Madrid and other places around town and taken to that museum. And from then on, that museum takes on a life of its own. In 1868, when the Spanish royal family is kicked out of the country and the First Republic is named, all royal property becomes public property. It remains so until this day. The kings came back, but royal property was never given back to them. All the royal collection belongs to the state. It's all public property. Okay, but we're still at a time when we're in the royal palace. The paintings have not gone to the Museo del Prado, which does not exist until 1819. This is a painting of 1617, and in it we see a very special woman there. You can barely see her, with her first cousin. She is Isabel Clara Eugenia, daughter of Philip II, who becomes the ruler of the southern Netherlands, or Spanish Netherlands as they were called at the time, of what we know now called Belgium. And she is ruling over a royal palace that you see through a window. the Royal Palace in Brussels, which burnt down in the 18th century. And she is proudly displaying, through the art of one of the greatest painters at the time in Europe, Jan Bruegel the Elder, she is proudly displaying one of the activities that she's devoted much of her love and attention to, which is the collecting of different kinds of items. And this is important for the history of the Prado as a museum of paintings for the following reasons. If you look to the lower left, or to the, let's see, to the left half of the painting, if we divide the painting in a diagonal and you look down here, a lot of what you see are different kinds of objects. You see a lot of porcelain, which is being imported from China via Manila, Acapulco, Veracruz, Cuba, Seville, or Lisbon, and then being disseminated through Habsburg networks all around Europe. You see scientific and navigation instruments. You see a lot of Turkish carpets on the lower left. You see golden cups that come from Germany. You see the latest technology in terms of telescopes. This telescope here is one that people who study the history of telescopes, they actually write about this one because it is the very latest one being developed in The Hague in competition with Galileo, who's developing another one with reverse mirrors in Rome. Everything that you see there is kind of a reflection of an interest in the wonders of the world. New technology, but also a lot of things that are being imported into Europe from a growing world. You see a lot of shells here. All the shells there are imports, none of them are European. You see flower paintings and flowers in which you see flowers that only grow abroad. So there's a combination of interest in scientific instruments and interest in exotica, which has become expensive and therefore a status symbol. In a way, this collecting of wondrous things is old-fashioned by now. It's dying at the end of the 16th and early 17th century. Isabel Clara Eugenia and her husband, Albert of Austria, represent kind of the end of that vogue, which, by the way, is absolutely exquisite in its taste and in how it fosters the production of extremely high level of quality items. By this, what I mean is enough generations of demand that sustain enough generations of training and of guild exams and what you need to do to have a very, very high sustained level of any craft. What you see if you look above and to the right of that diagonal is mainly the collecting of paintings. That's where the collecting by the great rulers and the great wealthy people of Europe was going to, collecting of paintings. More and more, and collecting of wondrous objects less and less. One doesn't completely substitute the other at any point, but there clearly is a tendency growing in this direction. And it's interesting to point to this painting because, as I said, she is the daughter of Philip II, and she has grown up in the Escorial and the Alcázar in Madrid, and she has grown up in this context, which is more and more all the time valuing the art of painting above others. And that has consequences that are going to be of major importance, and in which the Royal Collection in Spain and the Prado are going to play a special role. What you see on the left is a painting of Adam and Eve by Titian. Titian is one of the leading painters of the Italian Renaissance, lives a long life, dies in 1576, paints mainly in Venice, goes to Rome as well, is the royal painter of Charles V in the first half of the 16th century, and then of Philip II by the time his father dies. He never goes to Spain, but he portrays Philip and his father in different places around Europe. Kings of Spain rule over a lot of different provinces. They don't call them colonies. And they actually live in all these different places. Remember that Charles V is from Ghent, actually. He's a Flemish prince. Titian paints portraits of the royal family in different areas of Europe, never comes to Spain. In spite of that, by the time he dies, the Spanish Royal Collection has more paintings by Titian than any other place in Europe does. And for that reason, the Prado today has the largest collection of works by Titian that you can see, even more than in any single place in Venice. Never went to Spain, but his paintings were very collected and shown in large numbers in the Royal Collection in Spain. To the right, what you see is a painting by Peter Paul Rubens, who is born 1 year after Titian dies in 1577. Rubens is far and away, during the 17th century, the most famous, wealthy, successful, influential painter in all of Europe. Far and away. We may, in Europe, now be more familiar with Vermeer or Rembrandt or Caravaggio or Velázquez, but at the time, they all had looked up to him. They're all younger than he is. And at the time, he was far and away wealthier, more famous, more influential. And he remains that way in the artistic literature for a good couple of 100 years. He did come to Spain 2 times. One of those 2 times, he goes to the Royal Palace in Madrid. He is an ambassador who works for the Spanish crown, negotiating a peace treaty between England and Spain. Stays in Madrid 9 months between late August 1628 and April 1629. And while he's there, he does something that we're going to see a little bit more and more of in the future, and something which makes the Prado the special place that it is. And that is, he is standing in the same stage as important predecessors of his have standed on before. He is in the royal collection looking at paintings by Titian, who he admires and who has just died, who in turn has looked at paintings by his own predecessors. And he is sharing a studio in the Alcázar with an artist who was 22 years younger than him and who is soon to be the leading court painter in Europe, who is Velázquez. Velázquez is 22 years younger than Rubens, greatly admires him, shares a studio with him when Rubens is in Madrid, never changes his way of painting, but is very impressed with him in terms of a social model, what a painter can aspire to be. Rubens, according to Velázquez's father-in-law, copies every single Titian that he can see in Madrid. We don't know if this is true or not. We know only 4 of them. It would have been about 20. Whether it's an exaggeration or not, and people talk very rhetorically at the time, he fixes his attention on Titian while he is in the stage that Titian's paintings occupy. And he's doing it while sharing a studio with Velázquez, who is seeing him do it, and who turns his own attention to Titian. And therefore, they're creating this link, and they're insisting on the fact that being a link in a chain matters, and that art is about a connection to the past, and also it has an ambition to drive that chain towards the future. This remains very much at the core of European art until quite recently, when the idea of breaking radically with the past becomes an important thing. Again, at the time, it is very important for artists who feel that they are making the point of telling people, I am part of this chain, look back, you can tell, and I am driving it forward. And this change, so to speak, or this act of passing on the baton is happening in a particular place, in what is now the Prado, in the royal palaces in Spain. Okay, the paintings still haven't moved to that new building, but as Rubens walks the halls of those galleries, he is looking at Titians, he is copying them, he's having Velázquez see what he's doing. Rubens leaves Spain, Velázquez becomes curator of the royal collection. He receives a lot more Rubens paintings later on, to the point that we still own 91 paintings by Rubens at the Prado, by far the largest collection of Rubens in the world, much larger than anything in Belgium, where he's from, or in Vienna, or Munich, or Dresden, or Paris, or London, which all have large collections of Rubens paintings. Velázquez is receiving Rubens paintings even after he dies, because the King of Spain has become completely obsessed with his works and is buying all he can from his widow. Velázquez is the curator in charge of hanging, restoring, taking care of these things. And the bottom here, I show you these images of these 2 grand figures who want to be acknowledged as court painters, dressed in black, with the golden chain which Aristotle gave Alexander, and which is a sign of royal favor received by an artist. And they both wear that royal chain. It's interesting that this self-portrait of Titian was actually owned by Rubens. He had it in his collection. And when he died, the King of Spain bought that from his widow, not only Rubens' paintings, but that self-portrait as well. And by the way, all the copies after Titian that Rubens made in Madrid, Rubens made them and took them back to Antwerp to his studio. And they were going to be his working tools. When he dies, the King of Spain buys them all, and they all come back to Spain. He's completely obsessed with his paintings by then. Okay, this idea of the Prado as a stage goes on, or this idea of the Royal Collection as a stage goes on a bit further than the Royal Collection per se. The Prado has a reputation for that, but it's really local and spread through the correspondence of royal painters who work in Spain throughout the centuries, which include Tiepolo and his sons in the 18th century, Anton Raphael Mengs, the leading definer of good taste in Europe in the middle of the 18th century. The Spanish kings, like other kings in Europe, are competing to see who can hire the greatest artist in the continent, and these are usually coming from Flanders. By the 18th century, also from Italy, and these are the artists that are learning about that stage But you still don't have a lot of travelers going to Spain. Really, travelers aren't going anywhere but Italy at this time. This is, what you see on the right is a picture by Manet, Edouard Manet, 1860s or so. By then, there's a real vogue for Spanishness. They refer to it as Españolisme in French, a taste for all things Spanish. Spain becomes kind of the exotic place that one can travel to in Europe. It has a Muslim past, and it has the famous buildings in Córdoba and Granada and so on. While travelers go there to see these things, painters run into the unexpected, which is to them the talent of Goya and Velázquez. And what I show you here on the left is one of the court portraits of a court jester painted by Velázquez, who needs to get paid, who gets paid to paint a portrait of the king, but who likes to paint other figures, court jesters and court functionaries, because when he paints them, he can worry about how he paints and not what he's painting. And the art of painting, as it's perceived in the 19th century, is moving in that direction. What matters more and more is the language of art, and what matters less and less is the content of art. And it is that idea that is making European painters focus their attention on or find inspiration on Velázquez and Goya especially, who again they're beginning to discover through travels in the 19th century, not until then. Remember, art was being exported throughout Europe from Italy and Flanders. It was being imported into every other country in Europe. And it's not until the emergence of art dealing and so on, and the possibility of travel, that people start to know other places as well, and that local paintings that are not Italian or Flemish start appearing in other collections, museums, and in other dealerships around Europe. The similarity there is obvious. Manet finds, again, a way of painting that, as they see it, is genuine to itself. It doesn't need to rely, for example, to create an idea of depth on a floor perspective or geometric perspective of some kind. The painter is able to paint volume, the stated golden objective of painting, without any kind of relying on too many outside tricks by putting something on a back wall, for example. Velázquez is seen as a model of that, and this is what Manet is trying to do in this painting as well. And they do this on and on and on. There's a lot of paintings by Manet, by Monet, by Courbet. If you look at books, the books have copies, libros de copistas we call them, in the Prado. Every time someone comes to the Prado to study art of the past, they need to sign their name in. And if you look there, you find Manet, you find Courbet, you find Mary Cassatt, you find Bert Morisot, you find a lot of the leading, you have Thomas Eakins from the U.S., Pierre Bonnat from southern France. A lot of these painters, Eakins and Bonnat, come down to Madrid, go down to Seville. They're finding that there's something there that they find more exotic and different than other models which have been found in the past, mainly in Italy. And then, if they focus on Velázquez, what is it in Velázquez that is special in their eyes and still in our eyes today? This is, one of the most famous images in the history of the Western tradition, not known until people started going to Spain in the 19th century. Not well known until the 20th century. This painting never left the royal palace until it went to the Prado. After the Prado opened in 1819, this painting was made for King Philip IV, same guy that we saw earlier. You see him there reflected in a mirror with his wife, his second wife. It was made for him for a private chamber. It shows Velázquez himself looking towards us, painting a large canvas, too large to be anything that we know he painted other than this, so it may be this. In the mirror behind him are reflected the king and queen, which are reflected in a place that seems to coincide with the place that we occupy. And therefore the painting kind of projects towards our space. On the right we see one of his daughters, the infanta, in Spanish, princess or prince is whoever's going to occupy the throne. Infante or infanta are daughters or sons of the king and queen that will not occupy the throne. And all her court assistants and other people who are apparently reacting to our presence. We or whoever occupies our space, the king and queen presumably, seem to be, we seem to have awakened this mastiff, kind of, She's noticed, she's beginning to bow. She hasn't noticed, but she's starting to look at us. He hasn't noticed, but she seems to have noticed. So there's kind of an awakening of awareness of our presence. In the background, we see the man whose job it was. We know the names of all these people. In the background, a man whose job it was to walk through the royal palace, opening the doors for royalty as they walked through it. On the walls in the background, and on the right-hand side, and we know this because of royal inventories. We know what room this is. We know how much the room measures. We know that it looks the way it looks here. We know that the windows are where they are here. Every painting on the wall is a copy of a painting by Rubens that the king already owns in a palace that is about 8 kilometers down the road. And he has asked one of his court painters to copy all of them because he wants them in another palace as well. That's how obsessed he has become with Rubens by this time. There's an interesting story a little bit earlier, 1628. Velázquez has painted a royal equestrian portrait of the king, which hangs in his main throne room. When Rubens comes, the king tells Rubens to paint an equestrian portrait of himself. He unhangs the Velázquez and he hangs the Rubens there. This is how clearly in his mind this is what he wants to be, his image, and this is the painter that he has chosen to project his idea of royalty. For the most part, Rubens is a painter of mythology, mostly of erotic mythologies, and of a view of life that has to do with a certain poetic idea of plenitude. And we're not going to see any of those here, but that is what makes Rubens Philip IV's favorite painter, and that is what you see mainly at the Prado. So why does this painting matter so much? In the end, it's kind of like what we have around us. It's very real, and we need to go back a bit in time and realize that for painters in Europe from the 15th century onwards, there's a very clearly stated goal. And this goal drives them well into the 19th century, and that goal is to, Cennino Cennini, an Italian writer in the late 14th century, writes, to make that which is not be. That's the goal of painting. And how do you do that? You do that mainly through the consecution, I guess, of 2 challenges, which is to paint space and to paint volume. Leonardo da Vinci writes that what one should do is to try to paint on a paper a hand so that that hand seems to have volume and seems to be 3-dimensional. That is the high goal of the art of painting in Europe for many centuries, and that is so difficult to achieve that drives a technical training and an ambition that ends up opening many other doors and leads the art of painting in many other directions. But when it begins, and up until this point, that's what it's about. It's about, on a flat surface, painting something that seems to have depth. Volume, space. Velázquez is reacting here to something that he has learned in part from Leonardo, who spoke about how when someone paints, someone needs to be aware of the fact that there's atmosphere between the painter's eyes and what that person is looking at. If you look at distant mountains, they're blue. If you look at mountains that are close by, they're brown or green. If you look at more distant mountains, that blue becomes more pale. A writer who looks at Velázquez's painting about 100 years after he paints it, this is 1656, talks about how there's atmosphere between the figures. So that's one way in which he's doing it. He is simply carrying forth, learning generation after generation. And this is one of the things that the art of painting teaches us, I think. It seems to parallel the idea that life is learning and process, and maybe that's why we find it so meaningful. But what Velázquez is doing is carrying this further by learning from what has been done in the past. And one of the things that he has learned is that by, as I mentioned, putting that mirror in the back wall and projecting the reflection of 2 people on that mirror, he is bringing the limit of that painting out of the painted frame and bringing it into our space, and he's making the painting contain us, as if you kind of kicked on the floor or moved the air in this room, you were going to lift the dust and it would lift also in that space. And he's doing that again genealogically, one could say. He's learning about that. He's learning about that from a painting like this one, painted about 200 years earlier, now in London, but in the Spanish Royal Collection at the time. Velázquez hangs this, restores this, we must assume, knows that, well, he's responsible for it. And in this painting, Jan van Eyck has painted a mirror in the background. And in that mirror, he has reflected the back of the 2 sitters, but also in tiny size, himself and an assistant. And therefore, by painting that mirror, he has incorporated a space that's out of the painting. Velázquez has learned from that and is using it. And then another painting that's coming from Flanders, just about 10 years before Velázquez paints Las Meninas. This, in a more simple way, this is a type of painting, kind of a painterly concept, one could say, that becomes very fashionable in Antwerp, and only in Antwerp first, and then in Brussels, and then in Rome. And that's to paint portraits, so to speak, of your collection. And this is the ruler of the Spanish Netherlands at the time, Archduke Leopold William, surrounded by a major collection of paintings that ended up going to Vienna, and that's why Vienna has one of the greatest museums in Europe now. But notice that you have paintings on the wall, a door, a dog in the middle, and some dignitaries. Well, Velázquez is basically learning. He's finding fuel in the art of the past and using it in a creative way to make something of his own. We're going back 200 years, 1434, 1435, Roger van der Weyden, a deposition of Christ. Much art in Europe is portraits, much art is mythology, most of it erotic mythology, much art is religion. There's a lot of investment at different times and for specific reasons at different times. There's a lot of public money, we could say, royal money that goes into the promotion of certain things, religion, my image, whatever it may be, and that means that a lot of the attention and production of artists is focused on those subject matters. This is painted for a chapel in the city of Leuven, now about 20 minutes outside of Brussels. It's given as a gift by the ruler of the Spanish Netherlands, who's a woman, to her nephew, Philip II, and it's in Spain since, and moves from the Escorial to the Prado by the mid-20th century. This is strikingly beautiful, I guess we could say, even though beauty is a matter of taste to some extent. The colors are speaking about a very wealthy, expensive, carefully produced object. It's also strikingly realistic, at first sight at least, and realism is another mandate of European art. It's the same one I mentioned earlier. You need to paint something on a flat surface that looks real. How do you do it? You do it mainly, according to people who write about art, by painting volume and space. But there are other ways also of following that mandate, which is key, fundamental. If you're not doing that, you're a lesser artist than if you're doing it. You achieve an illusion of reality, you're a better artist than if you don't achieve it. It's as simple as that. Up until the early 19th century, when there's a very radical rebellion against an idea that has become very old by then. And the rebellion is what drives the future of painting in Europe. But at this time, that's very clear. So realism in this case means what? Mainly it's a realism in the details. If you could see a better slide or this in the Prado, you would see the little beard of Christ and all the minute details of the plants on the floor and how the blood falling from the side of Christ falls down the length of the body, reminding us that the body used to be hanging, but it's beginning to change direction because the body has already changed direction, and on and on. Everything there is so realistic in the detail that it makes us think it's real. Yet the space obviously is kind of emphatically unreal. This is simply a box that is too shallow. Not only that, there are other things. The body of the Virgin, this blue outfit made with a very expensive lapis pigment, ground stone, that body is way too long. Even the ladder on which this man is standing is so close to the front here, and here it's way too far back. Many things here spatially simply do not seem to work, and the only thing that we can do is ask ourselves why. We don't really have the answers. My intuition is that there's a growing awareness, and this is kind of the beginning of the mystery of the greatness of painting. There's a growing awareness that in spite of the fact that the stated goal of painting is to be realistic, in trying to achieve that goal, a lot of doors are opening themselves. And the manner in which one does that is worthy of merit in itself. And that manner in which one tries to achieve an impression of life-likeness becomes something that intuitively takes us to formal awareness, to awareness of the language of art and not of the content of art. And by that I mean the difference that we can imagine, for example, if we see a couple walking across a square, they get from one end of the square to another one. But if we see a couple dancing across a square, we've seen something different. Not only have they gotten from one place to another, but they've done something which has formal meaning, which has added to kind of a poetic way of reasoning or a poetic way of understanding life, which is impossible to put into words. There is a growing awareness of the fact.
We have about 15 minutes left.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to go on for a while. We have a growing awareness of the fact that with the stated goal come these other things, this awareness of the beauty, the excitement that comes with an awareness of language. Okay, another major stated goal of art in Europe that I haven't mentioned so far is idealism. Idealism in the Platonic sense, in the old Greek sense, not necessarily in the Christian sense, even though what they do is overlap. What I mean by this is that when an artist paints an image like one on the left, whether one believes in the specific content or not, what the artist is trying to do is create something so beautiful that it will make us long for closeness, long to move in that direction. This is what Plato talks about in a very mystic way. Beauty makes us long. And what we long for is a more perfect place, the realm of ideas. And that they can be religious ideas or ideas of any kind. But the notion that art is a vehicle for idealism, that art only makes sense if it's going to put before our eyes a place that's better than the one we inhabit normally, that's absolutely key for a long time in the history of art in Europe, 15th and 16th century mainly. If you make shoes that aren't good to walk, what's the point? If you make paintings that aren't good that don't allow us to be transported to a higher place by this connection with beauty that makes us long for something, that makes us fill our chest, if it doesn't do that, what's the point of making a painting? And that's why I'm showing you these two images. They're, of course, trying to make us long for a specific religious ideal, but even if that's not what it is, the idea that painting is idealistic, it's absolutely key for several centuries in the history of art in Europe. But it begins to turn by the mid-17th century, and that turn leads us all the way until the 20th century. And in Velázquez, when he's living in Rome, you find a combination of, I need to paint a beautiful thing. There's no sense of painting anything if I'm not striving for that. But at the same time, I need to find value in things that are close by. It's not only what's up there that's great and what's up here that is a pale reflection of that greatness, but there can be beauty in what's around me as well, even in these wood and these fences and these things. And Velázquez really manages to achieve a beautiful balance there between a form of realism that is not devoid of the ideal of beauty. And this seems like a contradiction, and that contradiction defines this particular niche that is Velázquez in the history of aesthetics. And I'm going to show you 4 final slides rather quickly. So genealogy, Goya is the other big name that shows up in the court in Spain. Painting, great painting comes from Flanders and Italy. The demand is so sustained that great talent emerges locally in due time, Velázquez and then Goya. Same thing happens in other places in Europe. Goya comes to the court in Madrid in 1765 from Zaragoza and lives a long career, dies in 1828. He's really fairly close to us. He doesn't die such a long time ago. He paints in a very kind of Rococo, pretty court French style, one could say. Here he's painting the city of Madrid, which still kind of looks like this. The royal palace is still there. This is the new royal palace built when the old one has burnt down. Paintings have been taken to the Prado. Well, not yet here, anyway. And so what you see there is the city of Madrid. The river there is now a highway, but basically you're looking from the south towards the north. And it's kind of a, fancy society going out and partying, what we still like to do, not fancy society, but Spaniards. This is Goya later in life. And with Goya, what we see is a turn that's very representative of what's happening in the art of Europe, and that's what I'm going to end with, which is a turn inward. The idea of beauty has become stymieing. It's too much of that. It's not saying enough of us. Some artists, like Rembrandt way before him, have turned their thinking inward, and they feel that their art should be about inner longings, the inner person, something that doesn't really make it into the mainstream of European culture until Freud in the 20th century. But there's a sense of anguish and pain and loss and these kinds of things being expressed not through myth, but through personal feeling. And Rembrandt does that first, and Goya is very good at that. He decorates his house late in life with the same theme that he has just painted in the previous image that I showed you, but look at the difference. This is a festivity with people playing the guitar, drinking, out of town, same thing, but it's now turned into a nightmare. For reasons that are public in part, there's been a war, Napoleon has invaded Spain. Goya has lost his hearing. He gets paid by the Spanish king, but also by Napoleon's brother, who's king of Spain. Huge contradiction in his own lifetime. But also simply painting can be used to express inner ghosts, life of nightmares, things of this kind. And this is a fairly new thing that will make him very influential. And he makes a lot of prints. And what I show you here is a drawing which he's going to use to prepare a print. And this is the final print. And it says, El sueño de la razón. Here he's trying out different sentences to put under the image when he will publish it. And here he has chosen one that says, El sueño de la razón produce monstruos. That means the dream of reason produces monsters, which most likely, Goya is ambiguous. One of the great things of the art of painting is that images are ambiguous by their very nature, much more so than words, at least than words that are not part of poetry. What Goya seems to be saying here is that when the dream of reason sleeps, when we're not being reasonable or using reason as our main tool, monsters start, and monsters mean all that in humanity or in human life, which is war, violence, pain, all these things. All this can be argued. You can see this as opposite also, but it's most likely that which he is saying. And finally, so we can have a few minutes to talk, this is the last image that I'm showing you. Goya goes into self-exile after a very conservative government comes into Spain in the late 18 teens, and he goes into exile in Bordeaux in 1824, dies there in 1828. And his last drawings are amazing because you see this old guy in his 80s who is fascinated by new things that he sees. He sees people on skates, for example, or he sees people that seem to be taking pictures or doing things like that. And he's constantly drawing things and talking about these amazing things that are around him. And he makes this beautiful drawing in which he writes up on the right, I'm still learning. And he makes a drawing in a way, and I'll end with this, that should remind us that art is about content, but about form also, and I would even say mostly. It is form that becomes the carrier of content. And think of the very rugged kind of paper that is used and the very stiff carbon chalk paper, and think of the fact that all the white surfaces that you see there, his face, the hair, all that is not drawn or painted. That's simply the white color of the paper behind. And it's this ability of manipulating form and language which has been learned from all these generations, which have all shared the same stage, because Goya is royal painter and royal curator, and he hangs and displays and moves around paintings by Velázquez and by Rubens and by Titian and by Van Eyck and by all these others. So there's a special awareness of the workings and the beauty of the art and the language of painting that takes place in this particular space. Thank you very much, and if we have a little time, we can have some questions.
Can you please talk a little bit more about Goya?
Yeah.
I mean, when we visited Prado, we were really impressed by some of the angst in his paintings, and if you could comment on that also.
Yeah, Goya, he's a giant. Of course, we each have our own pantheon, and we each like what we like. Goya is an irregular artist. He has a classic training. He comes into court, which is the highest position a painter can have. He is close to Tiepolo Mengs and the past tradition which he cares for, so he knows how to paint beauty, idealism, anatomy. He has been trained in the correct way. He seems to grow tired with that. He seems to find that defective anatomy, for example, is more expressive than perfect anatomy. Rightly so. I mean, people have been painting perfect anatomy since 1480. It's been done so many times by then. His painting evolves towards a very critical point of view. And I would say that one of his secrets is not so much judging and telling us what we do right or wrong. I think there's maybe a lot of that in our own times. I think Goya reminds me of a better place to be, I think. And he seems to have a special way of telling us this is what's going on. Notice, take notice. look at reality with a critical eye, and then, you know, reach your own conclusions. Andy Warhol is a little bit like that, I think, sometimes. So I think he has a critical eye, and that critical eye is achieved through these kind of strange positionings of bodies, things of that sort. Goya is very often very abundant. There's a lot of paintings by Goya. We have about 140. I think he's the painter that's most highly represented at the Prado. And again, I like to think of him as a great court painter in the old tradition and a real modern soul, creative soul with a very different poetic vision than those around him. That became very influential for later generations just precisely for that reason, because he was able to take paintings in ways different from the Academy that had been very positive centuries ago but had become very, very kind of stagnant by then. So he has a huge range. He's irregular, and by that what I mean is that he can, you know, what do you do as a spectator who doesn't know an artist really well and who runs into a portrait by Goya in the Prado and it just looks ugly, as some do? What do you do with that? You can feel that I don't quite understand the artist. That's kind of what I was taught to do by my parents. I think it's a good attitude to have faith in what I've been told, and I'll get there. But then we know letters by Goya's friends who say, I want a portrait by you, but I want one of the good ones. Or in another letter, don't paint one of those that you paint for people who you don't like. So we know that in occasions some of these things that we find weak are seen as such by himself. And I think in the end, the quality that Goya has beyond others, that doesn't make him better than others, but it is fun and interesting to try to single out in different artists from any field what is peculiar to that. What's the virtue of Rubens or Velázquez or Shakespeare or Goya? Doesn't make it better than anyone else, but it's his or her virtue. And I think in Goya, there's a great range, and he's very attuned to the imperfections of being human and of life itself, of beauty, but also ugliness, of doing things well, but then not always being able to do them. Somehow there's something very real more than this art that inhabits the hot world of high ideas that you find in other artists. There's a question up there, yeah.
You've shown a certain trajectory of the Prado till today, where you are probably preparing another segment of that trajectory, which is the future of the Prado. So could you point towards the direction that you're taking it from now onwards? What are the new ideals? Which direction are...
Yeah, that's a very good question and a huge one. I hope if we have a couple of hours, it's a key question. By Spanish law, the Prado ends in 1881, what we show. That's the year Picasso was born, and Picasso, and later is in the Museo Reina Sofia, which is another museum, which is not nearly as important as the Prado because Spaniards were not the greatest collectors of art in Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries, while they were in the centuries that I've shown. So the best, as that term was understood at the time in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, ended up in Spain, among other places. The best, as that term was understood in the 20th and 21st centuries, has not ended up in Spain. So in that sense, we don't collect further chronologically. But what we do, of course, is worry about how to think about the past from our own times. And that's an open debate, which is changing. I've been there as a curator 23 years, so I'm gradually, not immediately, but gradually facing the end of my career and doing it with great comfort in the sense that I'm anxious and curious to see the voices of further generations, and it'll be up to them to change things. I find that my outlook, my job, the best thing I can do is to teach people to find value in the past instead of to be too critical of it. And to understand that the past is like traveling to a distant place, like here for me today. I arrived yesterday from Madrid. I'd much rather come here than go to Italy or France. Why is that? Because it's much more different, and I have a lot more to learn. And someone at home can make me think that things that happen here are less in tune with ideals of liberty and so on, that things that happen in France. And I'm like, it's not for me to judge. That's not why I'm going there. And I think the same is true when we travel to the past. And I think too often now, and this is a new thing, we travel to Goya and Velázquez and Jan van Eyck and so on, and we think about things that were being done wrong at that time. And I think it's about, You know, first of all, I think it's about the art. I think very strongly that art speaks to a part of ourselves that if we lose touch with, we simply lose something that we carry in ourselves, which is the potential for art or for poetic nature. But I also do feel strongly that it's interesting to travel to a distant past and to do it with the idea that, you know, most likely we would have been like them. And certainly they have some things to teach us. And we may look very silly to the future, certainly we will. And, you know, basically learn from them. Also, I think that one thing about the European past in these years, with all its faults, one great thing about it is how it placed so much value, time, and money from elites, especially from royalty, on the creation of this kind of art. And that means you need to have 300 years of generation after generation, training after training, 12 years in the house of a master, and then a guild exam, and then if not, you don't get this good. And good in technical terms. And, you know, with that, artists felt at a certain point that they had lost the freedom and they needed to leave all this behind. And, you know, I can imagine myself painting in 1920. I would have hated Velázquez or Raphael or whatever. And I would have ended up liking it a lot, but I would have thought, no more of that, enough of that already. Yet, it's incredible, really, when you go to Italy or any one of these places and see these things. You know? So I think our job is to make sure that we focus our attention on these things in a positive way. And then my curiosity is to see what future curators do with it, which I'll be very happy about, whatever it is, really. Thank you.